Sikong Shu, happy that my cousin Lulun stays the night. Nights pass in silence, no neighbors hereabout. Poor, I am obliged to live in this forsaken spot, where raindrops scatter over withered leaves. This white-haired ancient sits beneath his lamp. So I've stagnated here for all these years. Ashamed you come to visit me so frequently. Throughout our lives, you've always shared with me. How fortunate for me that we are family. So this is the second of 3 poems by Sikong Shu in this section of the book, in the pentasyllabic regulated poem style. As I was saying in previous days, the topic apparently is the same that has been going on in the previous poems. Remember, Sikong Shu is a Dali era poet. It's interesting that he quotes Lulun here. We know that Lulun, as we've talked about before, is the most famous of the Dali era poets. Sikong Shu is quite well known as well. I didn't know they were relatives, but it seems they were relatives and friends. And that's the real topic of this poem. The topic is not so much what I thought before I read it from the heading, which is a meeting of friends. Actually, the gist of the poem is a self-deprecatory one, where the poet Sikong Shu laments his uselessness, his worthlessness, and his poverty. So it's basically a poem, you could say the main subject, whatever the title, the main subject of the poem is really a complaint of Sikong Shu at his lack of success in life, and a little bit of self-deprecation as well. It's always implying that up to a point his failure is the result of his own lack of merit. And not much is described of the meetings between Lulun and Sikong Shu. So even though the title is about those, or evokes those times in which Lulun meets with Sikong Shu, we don't get a description of that. We get, as I said, the lamentations of Sikong Shu and his gratefulness towards his friend for being a friend and for being a relative. So quite different from what I expected. Quite different. Yeah? So as usual, let's check the poem couplet by couplet and see where that leads us. First couplet. Nights pass in silence. No neighbors hereabout. Poor, I am obliged to live in this forsaken spot. Remember, Chinese poetry is almost universally melancholic and pessimistic. So it doesn't need much prodding to dwell on melancholy, sad scenes. And the poem begins, the first couplet locates us in a pretty grim, desolate sort of landscape. Silence, night. So no sound, no sight. The night passes in silence. No neighbors hereabout. Now, one could think that having no neighbors might be a good thing, but remember, Chinese scholar officials are a really social animal. So even the hermits appreciate visits from time to time from other hermits and from scholar officials. So, this being alone strikes already a negative chord in a society like the Chinese, like the traditional Chinese one, that places so high a value in the collective, in the group, in being with others, in socializing. And if it wasn't clear enough that we're in a lonely and dark place, poor, I am obliged to live in this forsaken spot. The poetic persona declares himself poor and speaks rather ill of the place where he's living. This translation says forsaken spot. Another one that I've consulted says something like in the old family home, which seems to imply that Sikong Shu hasn't been able to build a house for his own or household and is living in the one belonging to his clan or extended family. But not that wouldn't necessarily imply that it had to be a dilapidated looking one. But anyway. Second couplet. So the first couplet has placed us in a scene, has given us a background, and it's a slightly dim and dark background. Where raindrops scatter over withered leaves, this white-haired ancient sits beneath his lamp. So the second couplet becomes much more descriptive, and zoom in if you wish. The camera moves in. We get a nature element surrounding the house. So raindrops scattered over withering leaves, probably autumn leaves. Remember, autumn also adds to the poem the melancholy sadness of autumn, of the season where beauty fades and old age starts to creep in upon a person. And from the vegetation to the speaker himself, this white-haired ancient sits beneath his lamp. It's raining, probably. Well, it's not probably, the raindrops are scattering. So it is raining. Rain is like the tears of heaven. Yellowing leaves, they're old. The poet is also old. He's an old, white-haired ancient, and he is beneath the lamp. Maybe reading, maybe drinking. But anyway, the prelude's sad elements get emphasized by this image, which could be, the image that synthesizes the poem. An old man under a light at night with rain falling and yellow leaves. Third couplet. So I've stagnated here for all these years. Ashamed you come to visit me so frequently. So there's a slightly change in focus in the third couplet. The first line of the third couplet continues with what has been described, a desolate place and a desolate, aged, old, defeated, poetic persona. But in this couplet, we get the transition. So the first line, I've stagnated here for a long time, but the second one introduces the topic of the poem, really. The gratefulness, the feeling of consolation and happiness that Sikong gets from the visits of his cousin. Ashamed you come to visit me so frequently. So Sikong might be ashamed at his misery, and therefore, he feels ashamed that his cousin and friend see him in such a state of lack of success and of lack of prosperity. But still it makes him happy because he appreciates his cousin, and this will become pretty clear in the last couplet of the poem, which addresses this. Throughout our lives, you've always shared with me. How fortunate for me that we are family. So there is a sadness in Sikong because of his lack of worldly success and of his present relatively poor conditions and his old age, but still he finds a measure of consolation and a measure of happiness in having always remained relatively close to his cousin Lulun. How fortunate for me that we are family and friends. In the original, this reference to family, I think, is clothed in a reference to an episode of antiquity. It says something like, how fortunate we are, our cousins of the Tsai clan or members of the Tsai clan. So this goes back to an anecdote from, I think, the period of disunion or before the period of disunion under the Jin dynasty, when a very successful politician, Yang Hu, got an appointment or an aristocratic title, and he insisted on being allowed to pass it to one of his cousins of surname Tsai. So it became a common reference, or at least, I'm not sure if it was common or pedantic, but anyway, it became a reference that could be used to refer strong friendship among relatives. And so concludes the poem. So not a bad poem, not bad. The images aren't too intense or too nature evocative, but it's not a bad poem, and I appreciate it changing the tone from the last one. It's not the tone is sad. Well, it's sad with a little bit of happiness, but for changing the general topic of, just talking about how sad you are that your friend is going away, or how incredibly lucky it is to meet another scholar official and a friend from the past. No, this is a different take, and all the more enjoyable because of that.